Hey guys, just wanted to do a quick hand review of an interesting hand I played at 100NL on PokerStars, Pennsylvania. Think it features some interesting theoretical concepts as well as how to apply some good exploits and player reads. And then after the hand, we will take a look at the solver just to sort of see some of the concepts visualized by GTO Wizard. So yeah, let's just jump into the hand. Hand starts four-handed here. The cutoff player is a recreational, and the other two players are regs. Um, Folds to the button, who makes it 2.2 bigs, and we put in the call with ace 6 suited. I think you can 3-bet some of the other suited aces, but I don't think this one gets 3-bet at all. It's just a bit too low equity compared to some of the other suited aces you can choose from. And a couple of reads for this Admiral Overbet player on the button. I think he is on the weaker side of being a reg, a little too face up in certain lines, not aggressive enough. I don't think he's bluffing enough, and I think he is a little bit too greedy with value, going really big, being really greedy with a lot of his strong hands, sort of mindless in his betting patterns with value. Um, Not really too reading into the situation super precisely. I think he plays a lot of tables, so maybe that's the reason. But yeah, a little bit inaccurate and a little bit passive, not super creative. So yeah, that's my read on this player, and we'll use that as the hand progresses. So the flop comes 9-4-6 rainbow. We check, and the button goes for a larger bet size, like around 60%, 2/3 pot. Um, so I think the clear decision is to just check call, but I actually think our hand makes a decent check raise already on the flop at similar frequency. We block some of the best continues that the button will have, so those are hands like pocket aces, ace nine, pocket sixes, even 6-9 suited. So yeah, taking these like middle pair hands and turning them into flop check raises as sort of like a mergey value bluff type hand actually has some good effects. Gives us bluffs on certain runouts where we otherwise wouldn't have that many bluffs, and those bluffs tend to have really good blocker and unblocker properties as well. It's just a little unintuitive to start raising middle pair here, and definitely call is the standard option. So yeah, we go ahead and put in the call. I think I would be more inclined to check raise a middle pair that has like some more backup equity, maybe like 5-6 of hearts or 6-7 of hearts, something like that, some backdoors. So yeah. Turn comes the 5 of diamonds, and I actually think after we call a big bet on the flop, and then this card is sort of like a medium card that fits in well with our big blind range. I think we actually are going to develop a lot of donk leads on this turn. Reason being that this card never improves any hands in the buttons range. So, and after we call the big bet on the flop, our range is condensed around a lot of like high equity hands, like sort of made hands like 9x, some 6x, a lot of like middling pairs, open enders, draws that improve on the 5, make 2 pair on the 5, sort of don't get downgraded very often because we lose a lot of that trash and air in our range when we call like the 2/3 size bet on the flop, as opposed to if he were to bet say like a third or fourth, we'll still have some air and some less lower equity floats that float flop, but not in this case. So our range is going to be pretty condensed around like decent equity hands. And then when this turn comes, I actually think we take probably a bit of an equity advantage because all of those overcards that c-bet the flop, like the Broadways in his range, just are still overcards and did not improve. And we also want to deny a little bit of equity against those cards with 6 outs to us, like King, Queen, King, Jack, etc. So I actually think a lot of our range is going to want to play donk leads here. I think our hand likes playing donk leads for that reason as well, just to sort of deny equity from those overcards. Um, I did consider leading in the moment in game, but I ultimately decided that I wanted to stick with a line that I knew a little bit better, was a little bit more familiar with against this reg, and I was pretty confident that my combo would be mixing checks and bets, as is pretty typical in spots where you lead the turn. It's generally a good idea to remember that turn leading becomes a thing when the flop. There was a big bet on the flop on a sort of, like pretty like maybe low medium texture where the big blind pre-flop aggressor can't be just betting range. They bet like a big size, we call, and then the turn is like a lower medium card that either pairs the board or like fits in nicely with a lot of our hands like this 5. That's when leads really start coming in. So it's an interesting spot to study and sort of become familiar with because I do think there is some EV to gain. We check. And the button player does check back fairly quickly, and this is another reason why we want to develop leads in situations like this, just because when we play like a range check on this turn or just a high frequency check, the button is going to be able to check back very often on these on these cards that are very low EV for him and high EV for us. And if we lead, obviously we don't give him that strategic option to check back and see a river and realize some equity with those overcards. So the river comes the deuce of spades, and generally this is a really good card for our range. And At our decision point here, we're going to be doing a lot of betting in general, so just a lot of value betting because we have a lot of value, and we will support that with a lot of bluff. So we're just going to be doing a lot of betting on this river. Something to note is that we have a very asymmetric 3x nut advantage. I think we have like basically all the 3x that we would have had, or sorry, most of the 3x that we would have had pre. That could call some stuff that had like backdoors, a pair plus a 3. We end up with a lot of 3s here in general. And I don't think the button has any 3x. And I also don't think the button has any 7-8 because I doubt that hand ever slows down on the turn. We also have just a lot of top pairs, like a lot of 9x, a lot of like 2 pairs, sets, obviously the straights that I mentioned. So we have a lot of strong hands. I'd say we're fairly uncapped in this line where we called the flop bet. That was pretty big. Check the turn and then arrive with the decision on the river. So we're going to be doing a lot of betting. However, as you'll see with this hand, we do have a range of hands that wants to just try and showdown and win at showdown against villains overcards. So hands like King X, maybe even some Ace X, and Queen X. And our hand, obviously a pair of 6s, could even consider like a thin block bet for value, but I would probably err on the side of just checking and trying to win, because in these lines I don't think that we are getting bluffed enough. So I think we check and have a easier to like we check and face a check back more often than we should. So we don't get put in as tough a spot when we check like a weak hand like this and then be forced to make an uncomfortable decision facing a bet. So I think the check is going to slightly overperform in my pool. So yeah, obviously we do have some hands that want to check and try and win at showdown, but we have to understand how to construct our checking range here on this river, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. So yeah, we do decide to check, and villain decides to go for like a 70% pot size bet, 7 big blinds. So right away, I start thinking back to some of the reads I had on this player, some of my exploits to potentially think about on this river. So my read that this size for this player is fairly weak. I think he'll be using large sizes, like overbet sizes, even when he's not allowed to, in theory. So I think he's fairly unbalanced in putting like nutted hands, like truly strong hands, into an overbet size. And this size that he used screams like 1 pair, over pair, something that's like semi-thin value, but still like a clear value bet. And that's just my read with this player. Not really paying too attention to the sizes he is and isn't allowed to use, who has the nut advantage and things like that. So I'm starting to read into that. I also think this player is potentially just under bluffing spots like this. One of my specific reads is he's under bluffing check down lines. So that would be like he, checked back the turn, and then I check the river, and then he has a decision when he's faced with a decision on the river here. When it's checked to him, I have potential read that he's under bluffing these lines. So I'm starting to really hone in that this 7 big blind bet, 70% pot, is very 1 pair heavy. So certainly we could bluff catch. But for the reasons that I've just discussed, I think this bet is actually fairly capped to 1 pair, and I think we'll probably lose a decent amount of the time when we call. You could argue that my hand is like a slightly plus EV bluff catch because it removes some combos of like pocket aces and ace 9. But I would argue that it's at least indifferent, if not losing against, these players who aren't bluffing nearly enough. And because I also don't think he's using any nutted hands in this size for the reasons I discussed earlier, I think he's repping like an extremely thin range of 1 pair hands, and this sort of motivates a very aggressive response to this bet. So let's start thinking about some macro factors of what our range looks like when we check river. So the question we should ask is, do you think we ever check the river with a nutted hand? I mentioned before that we're going to be doing a lot of betting because this river is very high EV for our range. But do we ever check river with a really nutted hand? And the answer is absolutely yes, we do. Specifically, we'll want to defend our checking range on the river, defend the hands that want to check and show down, like ace 6, for example, with nutted hands that maximize their EV by checking. And what does it look like for a nutted hand to maximize EV by checking? Well, it would be the case when the nutted hand interacts with villain's range in some way that produces a desired result, or at least very slightly, in theory. So, for example, if we have a hand that blocks the check back range of the button, then when we check, we are going to face a bet slightly more often on average. So what does that look like? So let's say, for example, we have a 5 in our hand, or a nutted hand that contains a 5. So like 5-3 suited, which is a straight, pocket 5s, which is a set, 5-6 or 5-4, which are 2 pairs. We'll often check them on the river because when we have a 5, it's slightly less likely that the button player has a check back hand, because the 5 heavily interacts with his check back range. If you put yourself in his shoes, a decent chunk of the hands that are going to bet flop, check the turn back, and then check the river back are going to be 5x hands like ace 5, king 5, queen 5, jack 5 suited, even 10-5 suited. And when we have a 5, it makes it slightly less likely he has those hands, and therefore sort of reproportions his range to be slightly more bet heavy when we interact with those checkbacks. That's a really interesting concept, and I'm happy to answer questions about it in the server if anyone has any questions, because it actually plays out in a lot of river spots when we're deciding between bet, check, block, what size, etc. So I think we'll be taking a lot of our 5x nutted hands and checking them on the river. So we are defended, or more rather, we have some value hands when we check, and then when we face a bet, a lot of these value hands are obviously going to want to raise for value. So I think it is credible if we were to decide to react very aggressively to this 70% pot size bet. Now moving to some more of the micro factors here of our exact hand and our combo. So I think our hand blocks some of the villain's value, and the hands that would either call or raise, if we were to bluff here. So those would be hands like ace 3 of clubs or ace 3 offsuit, obviously, because those are straights. Even a hand like ace 9 could consider a hero call, in theory, because having a 9 is pretty good. It blocks some of my value. So we block a hand like ace 9. We also block pocket aces, which could consider a bluff catch as well if we were to raise. Other than that, I think the ace is actually pretty clean, because a lot of the ace X that the villain would have is probably just going to check back the river and try and win at showdown with ace high. So I actually don't think we interact with the range of hands that will bet and then fold to a raise when we have our ace. Additionally, our 6 is pretty good. I don't think villain basically has any 6x in his range at this point. It would have had to use like a large size on the flop, which is already very rare for like middle pair. And then check the turn, which would never happen with a hand like 5-6 or pocket 6s, or at least very rarely happen. So I think our 6 is a pretty good unblocker to the folding range as well, and just villain's entire range, which is obviously ideal when we can't always just block value hands with a given card. So with that being said, I decide to capitalize on what I think is a weak line from villain, a capped line, one that's a little too face up and under defended, on a board that's really good for us. We still have some nuts, and we are balanced in the range of hands that we check on river, to have a sufficient value range that makes sense to raise and attack this weakness with. And I also just recommend like over attacking these spots, generally speaking, because at lower stakes and like even mid stakes, people have a really hard time defending against aggression like this, and it's really uncomfortable for them when especially the entire player pool is already under bluff catching, and under bluffing, so it looks really strong. So yeah, we decide to put in the river check raise with our middle pair or our second pair, to 28 big blinds, basically repping like 5-3 suited or pocket 5s or even a 2 pair. Honestly, we take a pretty big size, which we would do with a lot of those value hands. And villain thinks about it for like a little while, 20-30 seconds maybe, and eventually does lay it down. So we get this one through, which is really nice. So yeah, really interesting hand. If I had to guess, I would, probably say that the button folded maybe a 9, potentially even an overpair. This board is pretty scary for those types of hands. So yeah, that was a pretty cool hand. And now let's go take a look at the solver and see what GTO Wizard thinks about some of the decisions in this hand. Alright guys, I pulled up the hand in GTO Wizard. This is a pretty standard sim for button versus big blind, 100 big blinds deep. Flop 9-6-4 rainbow, check, face a bigger bet, and decisions back on us. You'll see that our range is raising a decent amount of the time, even versus this bigger bet size. It's just a product of this board being pretty dynamic. And if we go to our exact hand, we'll see that the EV of raise and the EV of call are actually basically the same, and raise performs well for the reasons I mentioned before of blocking some of the best continues like aces and ace 9, but denying some equity from overcards as well, some sort of like the king x, queen x Broadway region, and also making for a pretty good bluff on a lot of runouts to have bluffs in spots where we might otherwise not have good bluffs, and those bluffs would have some pretty good properties as well. But call is definitely the standard decision here, so we do put in the call. You'll actually notice that we do take some of those hands I mentioned, like some of those backdoor combo draws, like 5-6 of hearts, and check raise them at a higher frequency than like ace 6, because yeah, I think ace 6 is just a little bit of a stronger hand, needs a little bit less protection. Yeah, so call is definitely the standard decision. And then the turn is the five of diamonds. And you'll notice that the solver is actually leading a lot, donk leading this turn a lot, over half the time. And the reason for this is because of the large advantage that the big blind player has in the middle and the medium to high equity hands, not quite like of the nutted region, which is slightly comparable, um, but the middling region is a lot stronger than the buttons middling region. And this comes from hands like one pair, pair plus gut shot, sort of like medium equity hands, a lot of top pair, tons of top pair, by the way. Um, Meanwhile, there are a ton of hands in the buttons range that are complete trash and whiffed completely. So this is like this region here, just like the overcard Broadway region, and specifically this region of the offsuit broadways, which is a lot of combos, way more than the suited counterparts. And that, all of those combos are living here in the bottom, and they have nothing, and they never improve with this five, so there's just a ton of trash, and you'll see that, around half of the solver's range for the button is complete trash over cards. That is what is motivating this donk on the turn. To sort of prevent those overcards from realizing their equity, and just to generate that bit of protection and start to generate folds from hands with six cleanouts. Also to avoid facing the fairly high frequency check back. You'll see that when it does decide to bet on the turn for the button, it is really polar and using some big sizes, but there is a sizable check back as well. So we do decide to check our hand, which is fine. As I mentioned in the hand breakdown, it is going to be indifferent between checking and donk leading for basically every combo in the range. Even the combos that want to donk a lot are still mixing in some checks. So I think playing the check is totally fine. So we do check, and the river is this deuce. And if we look at our strategy after we get the check back from the button and the river comes the two of spades, you'll notice that we are betting a lot, only checking like 46% of the time, and using a lot of different sizes. And as I mentioned before, this deuce is a really, really good card for our range. So if you look here at the equity breakdown, we're just dominating the buttons range throughout the entire range. And this motivates a lot of betting. So the solver is using like some big sizes, some medium sizes, small sizes a lot. But I think the strategy I would be playing is probably like 33% or overbet, which is a pretty common sizing strategy in a lot of river spots. But you'll notice that we do have some strong hands that are actually checking. So if I isolate to the strong hands of straights, sets, and two pair, and then take a look at the checks, which are this region here of these, this green checking frequency among these strong hands. You'll notice that the checks are coming from this region here, and this region is a lot of 5x. As I mentioned in the hand, when we have a 5, it slightly will reproportion the buttons range to have less checkbacks, which means we will face a bet slightly more often. Now, whether this is a bluff or a value bet, it doesn't really matter because all of these hands are good enough to check raise most bet sizes, or maybe just check call like a massive bet size, but definitely check raise a bunch of sizes, which is a good quality for a hand that we trap on the river with. So you'll actually notice that if we come to the buttons range after we check, and we look at the check back range, you'll notice that all of these 5x are in the check back range. Hands that like turn to 5 and then are trying to show down. You'll also notice some 6x as well in this range. So when we have a 5, we remove some of those combos and make it slightly more likely that we are going to face a bet, which is something that we want, obviously, when we have some of these strong hands. So we do decide to go ahead and check. You'll see that our exact hand of the a6 can go for the check. It can also go for a thin block bet for value, but as I mentioned in the hand, I think checking is going to perform quite well. I don't think we're going to get put in enough spots when we do decide to check. He's just going to check back a lot of hands I can consider bluffing, and then we don't have to make a tough decision. You could argue that this makes an argument for blocking as well because we won't get punished by hands that'll raise our block. But I think checking is totally fine here, and the solver agrees. So we do decide to check. The button places this bet that is around like 70, 80%. And like I mentioned in the hand, this exact player I think is very sloppy with their sizings for their value bets, just using big overbets all the time with their nuts. You'll notice that the solver is taking these 3x hands, which are straights, and only using the 77% pot size. In fact, it barely ever uses, it basically never uses a size bigger than that, and that's because of the nut advantage that we have as a big blind, even when we check river. And it's good to remember that when one side has the nut advantage, the other side or the other player does not go crazy with the large bet sizes. So you'll see even the nutted hands are using like the normal size. And I don't think this player will be doing that with his nutted hands. In fact, I don't think this player will be bluffing enough either. So I think this size is very one pair heavy. And as a result, when it's back on us, if we go to our hand, you'll see obviously, a lot of those strong hands that we trapped with that have a 5 or some other properties are now check raising for value, which is to be expected because obviously those strong hands want to check raise. So we do also need some bluffs. And where are the bluffs going to come from? Well, you'll notice the bluffs are coming from a lot of 6x. So king 6, queen 6, jack 6, and 10 6. Specifically, the combos we still have. And you'll see it's happening like a low frequency of a pretty small frequency, but all of this frequency adds up to cover our value bets. We also will be bluffing some other low pairs and third pairs, some of like the pairs and ace highs that we check river with to try and show down, just because those are the type of hands that we check river with, and not bluff. If we had true trash, we would probably be bluffing it a lot on the river. In this node here, but we decide to check, which is going to be happening with a lot of pairs, which means our bluffs are going to be coming from a lot of pairs here. Also, pairs have pretty good blocking properties usually in these spots, so that's why the 6x and some of the lower pairs are getting turned into bluffs. If we go to our exact hand, which is the ace-6 of clubs, you'll see that the EV of raising to a big size and the EV of just calling are comparable. The solver thinks that the hero call, or not even the hero call, just the call is a winning call. It actually makes chips. But I think if you were to node lock or reproportion the button's range in this node where he bet 70% pot to be more one pair heavy, less nutted, and less bluffs, I think you would start to see this EV of the bluff catch go down to be like a true bluff catcher, 0 EV, or maybe even losing, and the EV of this raise would start to outperform, and you'd start to see it being done at a higher frequency. But even here, you'll actually see that the solver is using it at a tiny frequency as a raise because it does have some of those good properties of blocking some of the continues, blocking some of the value range, along with the other 6x and lower pairs. And because I have these reads on this player, I decide to attack with this larger size. So we do go for the big raise. And for some reason, GTO Wizard doesn't have the button's response to this raise, despite it being like our main raise size, which is a little weird. But yeah, we did get the fold from what I think is probably a one pair hand, like a 9 or maybe an overpair. So yeah, really interesting hand, demonstrating some of the concepts surrounding weaving in good exploits and good player reads into a solid theoretical understanding, and how like a good basis in GTO principles drives a sound, balanced strategy. Really specifically on like this river spot where we check river with a lot of strong hands, I think is like a really neat concept. Um, so yeah, that sort of wraps this analysis. I hope you enjoyed, and thanks for watching.